She walked into the pharmacy with a 5-year-old's prescription, hoping pocket change would be enough. Minutes later, the same woman knelt beside a stranger on the sidewalk, her hands giving life where the system had given up. If stories like this inspire you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more powerful narratives. 5. The bell above the pharmacy door gave a dull chime as Melanie Carter pushed it open with her shoulder, a soft jingle that didn't seem to belong in the sterile quiet of the storefront. She adjusted her grip on Aiden's hand, trying to keep him close while reaching for her tattered wallet buried deep in her bag. The boy had his hoodie zipped up to his chin, but the redness around his nose and the faint wheeze in his breath betrayed the chest tightness creeping back. He was trying to be brave, she could see it, his small jaw clenched in silent determination. Melanie knew that look too well, mirrored from years of her own quiet battles. They had been here twice this week already, the first time for a cheaper over-the-counter remedy that had done nothing, and the second time to inquire about the actual inhaler prescription, only to learn it was back-ordered. Now a refill had come in, and she had scraped together what little she could to try and pay for it. Her fingers were cold from the walk, and her cheeks flushed with wind, but that didn't stop the sweat pooling at the back of her neck, the kind that had nothing to do with weather. It was anxiety, raw and rising, the dread of coming up short again in a place where there was no room for negotiation. At the counter stood a young pharmacist technician who Melanie recognized from previous visits. Her name tag read, Janelle, and her face, though polite, bore the look of someone stuck halfway between sympathy and discomfort. Melanie gave a small smile, one that barely reached her eyes, and set Aiden's prescription on the counter. She placed 3 crumpled bills and a handful of coins beside it. "It's all I've got," she said, keeping her voice even, quiet enough that only Janelle could hear. "I was hoping with the discount card it might be enough. I checked online. It said it could knock it down to 42. Janelle picked up the paper slip and scanned it quickly. Her eyes darted to the register. There was a short pause before she began typing. Melanie felt her stomach twist as each tap of the keyboard brought them closer to the total, to the moment she feared. "It came in yesterday," Janelle murmured. "Let me just check what manufacturer fulfilled the order." Melanie's fingers tightened around Aiden's. He leaned against her leg, the quiet wheeze now growing slightly louder. His little fingers were dry, knuckles reddened from the cold. He didn't complain, just stood still and waited, even though his breathing wasn't right. That still Nessie's version of courage made Melanie ache in places she didn't know could hurt. Janelle's face fell as the number appeared. She didn't even say it at first, as if giving Melanie a second to prepare. Melanie saw the price on the screen before the words came out. 74, Janelle said softly. "The discount didn't apply to this batch. It's a new supplier. I'm sorry." Melanie blinked. The coins on the counter seemed suddenly absurd. Little discs of insult. She had counted every penny, dug through cushions, even sold a lamp on Marketplace the night before. All of it, and it still wasn't enough. "I thought," she began, but stopped. There was no point. It wasn't Janelle's fault. It wasn't anyone's, really, and yet that made it worse. "I can hold it for you," Janelle offered, keeping her voice low. "Up to 3 days." Melanie nodded slowly, swallowing the frustration that climbed up her throat like bile. She wanted to scream, to cry, to tell the universe that this wasn't fair, that her son shouldn't have to suffer because she worked double shifts cleaning offices and still couldn't afford something so basic. But she said none of it. Instead, she slipped the bills back into her wallet with practiced dignity and picked up Aiden's hand again. "Come on, baby," she said, keeping her voice light. "We'll come back for it soon." Aiden didn't say a word. He was used to these moments, too used to them. As they stepped outside, the cold air slapped Melanie's face. The sky was gray and low, the kind of gray that seemed to press down on the buildings, pressing down on her. She pulled Aiden's hood up over his ears and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. He was breathing through his mouth now, lips slightly parted, each inhale thinner than the last. They didn't have far to walk. Their apartment was about a 10-minute stroll from the pharmacy, but with Aiden's condition, 10 minutes could stretch painfully long. Melanie slowed their pace, let him rest when he needed to. They passed shuttered shops and a woman pushing a stroller on the opposite side of the street. No one looked twice at them. Melanie felt invisible, not in the magical, carefree way, but in the kind that stung like you could be breaking in half in public and the world would keep turning. "Mommy," Aiden whispered as they waited to cross the street, "will it be okay?" She nodded and smiled down at him, even as her eyes prickled. "It's going to be okay, I promise." He nodded, trusting her in the way only children can trust their mothers, without question, without hesitation. Melanie hated how much that trust felt like a weight she couldn't carry. They were nearing the corner park now, the same one where Melanie used to bring Aiden before his asthma flared up last winter. It was mostly empty today, save for a jogger doing loops around the perimeter and an older man feeding pigeons near the bench. Melanie glanced at the jogger, noting his form, his sweat. He looked healthy, fit, focused. It was the kind of casual freedom Melanie hadn't felt in years, just being able to breathe hard because you chose to, not because life was crushing you. She turned her attention back to Aiden and nearly missed the moment the jogger stumbled. There was a break in rhythm, just for a second. His hand went to his chest. He slowed, staggered, then collapsed forward like a puppet with its strings cut. Aiden gasped. Melanie froze for a split second, her mind struggling to catch up. Then everything moved at once. She handed Aiden her phone and dropped to her knees beside the man, her heart already pounding not from panic, but from something else familiarity. She had trained for this once, years ago. The textbook instructions, the compressions, the clear head in chaos, all of it came back in a rush. As she pressed her palms against the man's chest and began to count, she didn't think about money, or bills, or what Aiden was watching. She didn't think about the pharmacy or the pity in Janelle's eyes. She only thought about breath, rhythm, pressure, survival. Because someone had to think about that. And she knew, in that moment, if she didn't, no one else would. And so she kept going. Melanie sat on the frayed couch in their apartment that night, staring blankly at the flickering light bulb above the kitchen sink. Aiden was asleep in the next room, curled beneath a faded quilt stitched together by her grandmother years ago. His breathing had calmed since the scare earlier, steady now, though it had taken hours for her to relax enough to notice. She had read to him for a long time, longer than usual, her voice barely trembling as she turned the pages. Now the silence in the apartment pressed around her like insulation, and for once she welcomed it. She held a cup of weak chamomile tea between her palms, more for the warmth than the taste. The corners of her eyes burned from exhaustion, but her mind refused to settle. Her muscles ached from kneeling on cold concrete. Her wrists felt tight from the compressions. Still, it wasn't her body that weighed her down. It was everything else. The pharmacy visit replayed in her head, each moment more humiliating in hindsight. Her voice had sounded too hopeful, too desperate. The coins had clinked in her hand like proof of failure, and the look on the tech's face had said everything, even without judgment. There had been a time, not so long ago, when her hands had known medicine as more than survival, back when she wore scrubs that weren't second-hand, when she carried a badge and felt pride walking into clinicals. She had been in her final semester of nursing school when everything started to collapse. One minute she had been standing at a simulation dummy, practicing intubation with the confidence of someone certain she was building a future. The next, she was sitting alone on the edge of her bathtub, clutching a plastic stick with a pink plus sign glowing on it. The line had come quickly, unflinching and absolute. Her boyfriend at the time, Jared, had been less constant. He had stared at the test like it was a riddle, like the answer wasn't written in bold. He had nodded slowly, kissed her cheek, said, "We'll figure it out," with that distant calm that always meant the opposite. Within weeks, he had stopped answering calls. Within months, he was gone entirely. Melanie hadn't chased him. She had been raised to believe that chasing someone who had already turned their back only ended with more bruises. She remembered calling her academic advisor to explain the withdrawal. She remembered the woman's voice, kind but firm, telling her she could always return, but there would be paperwork, delays, reapplications. There would be a deadline. Melanie had watched it pass from the sidelines as Aiden grew inside her. She never re-enrolled. It hadn't felt like quitting, not at first. It had felt like pausing. But that pause became a year, then 2, and then life rearranged itself around new priorities. Aiden arrived after a difficult labor that left her physically wrecked and emotionally raw. There had been no partner beside her, only a tired nurse holding her hand during contractions. She remembered looking into her baby's face for the first time and feeling something split inside her, not from pain but from fierce clarity. It was no longer about ambition or pride. It was about him. She would do anything to protect that fragile chest rising and falling in sleep. She would trade everything she had ever dreamed of for one more day where he could breathe without struggle. So she worked. She cleaned offices late at night. She babysat for neighbors. She took odd jobs posted on bulletin boards and freelance apps. Sometimes she delivered groceries until her feet throbbed and her eyes blurred. Her own meals became afterthoughts. Birthday candles were dollar store finds. Rent was always paid last minute. But Aiden had a roof, clean clothes, and love. He had stories before bed and someone to hold his hand when the world felt too loud. She made sure of that, even on days when her own hands trembled from fatigue. What had surprised her most was how quickly she adapted to being invisible, how people looked through her when she swept floors or wiped down tables, how they handed her tips without eye contact, how they seemed to forget she existed the moment the job was done. In some ways, it was easier than resentment. It allowed her to move through life unseen, uninterrupted, but sometimes, like today, it reminded her of how far she had drifted from the person she once thought she'd be. Tonight, though, something different pulsed through her veins. Not pride, not yet, but something close to it. On that sidewalk, kneeling beside a stranger, the silence of the watching crowd had fallen away. Her old training had surged forward like instinct, filling the void. Her body had remembered what her life had tried to forget. She had counted compressions out loud, heard herself command bystanders, checked for breath, adjusted her pace. It had been terrifying and grounding all at once. And when the man gasped, when his eyelids flickered and she felt the return of rhythm beneath her palms, a spark lit inside her that hadn't burned in years. She wondered now who he was. Not that it mattered, not in the moment. She would have done the same for anyone. But still, the memory of his face stuck in her mind. Middle-aged, graying at the temples, his running clothes clean and expensive. He didn't look like someone used to relying on strangers. She hoped he was okay. She hoped someone was waiting for him at the hospital, someone who would tell him what happened. Her phone buzzed beside her on the couch, vibrating with a late-night alert. She glanced at it briefly, saw a local news headline, something about emergency services responding to a cardiac incident near Glenwood Park. Her chest tightened. That was him. She stared at the phone for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen, but she didn't click the link. There was nothing in the article that would change what she had done. There was no mention of her, she was sure of it. Just another nameless woman, walking home with her child, doing what needed to be done. That was enough. It had to be. She turned off the lamp and walked barefoot across the creaky floor to Aiden's room. He was still sleeping, lips slightly parted, cheeks flushed with warmth. His stuffed dinosaur was tucked under one arm. Melanie pulled the blanket higher over his shoulders and sat at the edge of the bed. Her hand hovered above his chest for a moment, just to feel the steady rhythm. When she was sure it was there, she let out a slow breath of her own. The tea had gone cold. The apartment was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel powerless, not invincible, not transformed, but simply like herself again. The version of herself that had once believed she could heal people, that had once dared to imagine a life of meaning, of purpose. Maybe she wasn't so far from that person after all. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to try again. The sirens hadn't arrived yet. The world around Melanie had turned hazy, muffled, focused only on the heaving chest beneath her locked hands and the small voice she'd left behind on the sidewalk. She had handed her phone to a bystander, a teenage girl holding a smoothie in one hand and the leash of a small poodle in the other. The girl looked stunned, uncertain, but Melanie's voice had cut through her hesitation. "Call 911, she had said. "Now, tell them he's not breathing and that CPR has started. Say we're at the Glenwood Park South entrance by the benches." Melanie had not waited to see if the girl followed through. She had already dropped to her knees beside the man, brushing aside a fallen water bottle and grabbing the strap of the small armband he wore. It was soaked through with sweat. He had gone down hard, the side of his face scraped from the pavement, one leg twisted under him. She had tried to feel for a pulse and found nothing. His chest wasn't rising. His mouth was slack and tinged blue. Time bent strangely in those moments. Her body took over while her mind raced. She tilted his head back, checked his airway, cleared it with a careful finger sweep, then positioned herself and began compressions. Her palms pressed down through layers of fleece and cotton, aiming for the sternum 2 inches deep, straight down, keeping count under her breath like a metronome that refused to break rhythm. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, she recalled. She hadn't done it in years, not since school, not on a real person. But the knowledge had waited quietly in her bones for this moment, and now it flooded forward as though awakened. The man's body shifted with each pump. His chest rose and fell with her breaths. The world around her cars rolling past, conversations, the poodle barking somewhere behind faded to a low buzz. She could smell his cologne, faint and sharp beneath the sweat, and the sour tang of saliva drying on the cold concrete. Aiden's soft voice called out to her a few times, but she didn't look up. She couldn't. Someone was crying. Not loudly, just that kind of startled sobbing people do when they're witnessing something they never expected to see. A few feet away, someone else had pulled out a phone. She didn't care. If they were filming, so be it. If they were waiting for her to fail, they'd have to wait longer. Her arms were shaking now, but she didn't stop. Another cycle, another breath, still no pulse. The ground beneath her knees felt like ice, and her jeans were soaked from the damp pavement. Her breaths came faster now, not from panic but exertion. She couldn't stop. Not until someone with a uniform arrived, not until she was told to. The girl with the phone was speaking loudly now. Melanie heard the words: chest compressions, adult male, not breathing, no pulse, possible cardiac arrest. She felt a flicker of something. Relief. She wasn't alone anymore. Then, as she pressed down again, the man's chest jolted differently. Not from her force, but from within. She paused. His lips parted. A choking, rattling sound emerged. His torso jerked once, then stilled. Melanie leaned in and felt a faint puff of air. Her fingers found a fluttering beat at his neck. She drew back slightly, not yet moving away. She watched his face, saw the twitch of muscles around his eyes. His skin was still pale, clammy, but there was life now, something trying to return. Someone yelled that they could hear the sirens. Seconds later, the street behind her erupted in color. Red and blue lights bounced off storefront windows and car hoods. A fire engine and an ambulance pulled up in tandem. Uniformed figures rushed toward her, shouting questions as they came. She lifted her hands, breathless, and slid backward to make space. Her jeans stuck to the ground, and her thighs trembled from the cold. One of the EMTs knelt beside the man, while another moved toward her with quick, practiced efficiency. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, unsure if she was lying. "What happened?" another asked. Melanie recited it simply. Collapsed. No breathing, no pulse. Started CPR. He came back 30 seconds ago. They nodded. It was all they needed. The team worked in coordinated silence now, attaching pads, oxygen, and IV. One of them asked her name, and she gave it. They didn't ask for more. She looked over and saw Aiden standing near the teenager who had called. His little face was tight, but he looked proud. That part caught her off guard. Not scared, not crying. Proud. She stood slowly, legs unsteady, and walked to him. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pressed his face against her coat. Melanie stroked his hair with a trembling hand. He didn't ask questions. He just held her. "Mommy helped that man," he said quietly. "I did my best," she whispered. The man on the ground was being lifted onto a stretcher. His chest was rising and falling now with the rhythm of a breathing bag. His face had more color. Someone was placing monitors on him. Melanie watched as the team worked. Then one of the EMTs approached her again. "You saved his life," he said, not as a compliment, but as a fact. "If you hadn't stepped in when you did, he wouldn't have made it." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "Do you want to come with us to the hospital?" he asked. She shook her head. "I have my son," she said. "We need to get home." The EMT nodded with understanding. No judgment, just respect. "Thank you," he said sincerely. They loaded the man into the ambulance and drove off. The fire engine followed. The street slowly began to return to normal. The girl with the dog gave Melanie a quiet nod, almost reverent, before walking away. Melanie looked down at her hands. Her palms were pink and sore, the skin slightly raw from friction. She felt the ache settle into her wrists and shoulders. She let out a breath that seemed to have been trapped inside her since she first saw the man fall. Aiden tugged at her coat. "Can we go home now?" he asked. She nodded. They walked the rest of the way in silence. Her body was cold. Her mind was quiet. It was only later, when she closed the apartment door behind her and sat down on the floor, that the magnitude of what had happened began to settle in. Someone had lived because she had been there, because she had remembered what to do, because she hadn't hesitated. And no one, not the pharmacy, not the bills, not the loneliness, could take that away. Savannah Kim was still in scrubs when her phone buzzed on the corner of her desk. She had been catching up on notes from her latest surgical rotation, her third cup of coffee growing cold beside the keyboard. The text that flashed across the screen was short, but enough to snap her out of her routine. It was from an emergency department nurse she trusted. "Your dad. Glenwood Park. Ambulance en route. CPR performed by bystander." She didn't remember grabbing her keys or saying goodbye to her team. The world blurred around the edges as she moved. Her father, Dr. Howard Kim, had retired from active surgery just last year, stepping back from his decades-long post as chief of cardiothoracic surgery at the same hospital where she now worked. Everyone knew him. He was a figure in local medicine, a mentor to dozens, a guest lecturer in his spare time. He jogged every morning at the same park, same route, same pace. She had warned him it was too much sometimes, especially after his mild blood pressure scare last fall. He had waved her off, telling her that being still was more dangerous than moving. By the time she reached the ER, he was already there. The moment she stepped through the double doors, she saw his sneakers poking out from under a thick emergency blanket. He was awake, disoriented, and connected to several monitors. A bag of fluids hung beside the bed, and an oxygen mask fogged with each breath. Nurses flanked him, and a physician stood by reading over vitals. Savannah's feet moved of their own accord. Her heart didn't start beating normally again until she saw him blink and track her with his eyes. "Dad," she said, gently taking his hand. His fingers squeezed back, not strong, but enough. "I'm here," she whispered. "You're okay." He nodded slowly, voice muffled under the mask. "Someone helped me." The attending physician glanced up from the monitor. CPR on scene, by a civilian, not EMS. She kept him alive until we got there. Excellent technique. No rib fractures. We've stabilized him. He was lucky." "Do we know who it was?" Savannah asked. The doctor shook his head. "No name, no ID left behind. Just a witness report and a note from the paramedics. Young woman, red hoodie, left before we could speak to her." Savannah felt her throat tighten. Her father's life had depended on the quick thinking of a complete stranger. A woman who knew how to do chest compressions correctly, under pressure, alone. Someone who had vanished the moment the work was done. She turned back to her father. "Do you remember what happened?" she asked. His voice was raspier now, but clear. "I was running. Chest started to hurt. Then everything went black. Woke up to someone's hands on me. She told me I'd be all right. Then she was gone." The emotion in his eyes startled her. He was not a man easily shaken, but there was something raw in him now, something humbled. Savannah stayed by his side until he was moved into observation. Once he was resting, she stepped out to call the paramedics directly. The name she got was Melanie Carter. No address, no phone number. Only a first name from the ambulance crew, and the girl who had called 911. The rest was fragments. A child at her side, a calm voice giving orders, faded jeans, a red sweatshirt. Savannah opened her laptop and began typing. "Looking for the woman in the red hoodie who saved my father's life this morning at Glenwood Park. Please share. We want to thank her." She posted it on her personal account and then tagged the hospital's public relations page. She didn't expect it to go far, but within an hour, the post had been shared over 100 times. A local news outlet reposted it with the headline, "Doctor seeks mystery hero after father's collapse." Comments poured in. People guessed. People speculated. But no one came forward. The thing that struck Savannah most was how quickly people had taken to the story. They wanted to believe in someone like that. A nameless figure who didn't ask for credit, who saved a man and walked away. The next morning, the story aired on the local news. A grainy photo taken from a distance showed a woman kneeling over a man on the ground, her back to the camera. The child beside her clutched a stuffed dinosaur. The anchor praised the stranger's courage. Savannah's name was mentioned briefly, but only as the grateful daughter of the man who'd survived. That same day, Savannah's father sat up in bed and asked again if they had found her. When she said no, his mouth tightened in quiet thought. "She knew what she was doing," he said. "She had training." "You're sure?" She didn't panic. She compressed evenly, checked my airway, called for help. "That doesn't come from a CPR poster. That comes from knowing." Savannah agreed. She'd watched enough resuscitations in the field to know that most civilians fumbled. That wasn't their fault, of course, but this woman had done it like she had been trained for worse. She hadn't flinched. That stuck with Savannah the most. The hospital's communications director suggested turning the search into a formal campaign. They wanted to call it Find Our Hero. Savannah declined. It felt wrong to turn something so intimate into a spectacle. Her father hadn't survived because of a PR stunt. He had survived because someone cared enough to act, to risk exhaustion and fear and failure without knowing if it would matter. Still, Savannah wanted to find her. Not for headlines, for something else. Late that night, she returned to the ER and reviewed the 911 transcripts. The operator's notes showed the caller had given a precise location. The caller was a teenager who had stayed on scene. Savannah reached out and arranged a phone call. The girl confirmed the woman's name was Melanie. She didn't know more than that. Melanie hadn't offered anything except calm instructions and the assurance that her child was nearby. Savannah closed her laptop slowly. That was something she hadn't known. The woman had performed CPR while keeping her child safe beside her. That changed things. That meant everything she did as a mother, too. Savannah leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. In medicine, stories like this didn't happen often. Usually, help came too late. Usually, strangers didn't know what to do. But this time, someone had. Someone not on a shift. not in uniform, just a woman walking home. And because of that, her father was alive. She promised herself that night she would find Melanie Carter. Not because the story was incredible, or because the public was watching, but because when someone saves the person you love most in the world, you do not let them disappear. Not without saying thank you, not without making sure they know they mattered. The next morning began like all the others. Melanie woke to the sound of her old alarm clock buzzing unevenly on the windowsill. She rubbed her eyes and glanced at the ceiling, not ready to leave the warmth of her blankets. In the quiet hush of the room, she could hear Aiden's gentle breathing from the floor beside her, where he had fallen asleep with his books scattered around him. It had taken both of them longer than usual to settle after what had happened at the park. She had said nothing about the man she helped, offered no details, and Aiden had not asked. He had only said he was proud of her before dozing off in his usual tangle of limbs and stuffed toys. She made oatmeal the way he liked it, thin with too much cinnamon, and they ate with the soft morning sun spilling in through their small kitchen window. Aiden giggled at the sight of syrup dripping down the side of his bowl and asked her if they could go to the park again soon. She paused for just a breath before agreeing. She didn't want him to be afraid of the place. What he had witnessed was something real, something that rarely touched children so directly, but he had handled it quietly, watching with big eyes and a steady kind of trust. She owed it to him, to keep moving forward. The two walked to school as usual, passing the corner shop with the flickering sign and the dog that always barked from behind the gate on Elm. She kissed him goodbye at the gate and watched until he disappeared inside. Then she started back down the sidewalk toward the library, where she sometimes used the computers to look for extra gigs. She passed a newsstand as she crossed the street, and only barely noticed the local paper's cover. The words were loud. Mystery Woman Saves Renowned Surgeon. There was a grainy photograph beneath the headline. She barely looked at it. These stories came and went, and she didn't stop to think it might be connected to her. She didn't notice the way people were starting to glance at her differently until later that day. At the corner bakery where she picked up a free roll from a kind worker who knew about her shifts, the cashier stared for a beat too long. When Melanie thanked her and turned to leave, she heard the woman whispering behind her to a coworker. Later, at the laundromat, someone nodded at her with a look of recognition that didn't make sense. By the time she picked up Aiden from school, 3 people had mentioned something about the park. One woman asked if she was the nurse or paramedic or whatever from the news. Melanie had laughed politely and said no, brushing it off before grabbing Aiden's hand and walking faster toward home. That evening, after Aiden had gone to bed, Melanie sat on the edge of her couch, scrolling through a social media feed on her cracked phone. That was when she saw the post. A photo of her from behind, bent over the man on the pavement, a small red sleeve showing where Aiden had stood just out of reach. The caption said, "Still searching for the woman in the red hoodie who saved my dad. If you know who she is, please help us thank her." The name on the account was Savannah Kim. Melanie didn't recognize it, but something about the tone of the words pulled at her. There were hundreds of comments already, people speculating, others calling her a hero, some sharing it to their own pages, tagging local groups. She blinked and read the post again. Her stomach twisted as she set the phone down. Her face wasn't visible in the photo, but anyone who had been there would know it was her. Anyone who saw the way she dressed, the way she moved, who knew her at all, could piece it together, and yet no one had come directly to her. Not yet. She didn't want the attention. That wasn't why she had helped. She had no intention of stepping into a spotlight that only reminded her of what she used to dream of becoming. It hurt too much to be near it without having the strength to chase it again. The knock on her door came 2 days later, when the buzz had reached its peak online. A short woman stood in the hallway, holding a canvas satchel and wearing a badge from a local news station. She was polite, hesitant, but direct. "Are you Melanie Carter?" she asked. Melanie stared, unsure whether to deny it or invite her in. "I'm not here to pressure you. I just want to ask about the park. about the man you helped." Melanie said nothing for a moment. Then she stepped outside and pulled the door halfway shut behind her, keeping Aiden asleep inside. "I don't want a camera," she said quietly. "There's no camera," the reporter assured her. "Just me. People are trying to find you. The man you saved is Dr. Howard Kim. His daughter's a surgeon at Memorial. They've been posting about you for days." Melanie looked down at her hands. They still bore the faint marks from the sidewalk. A little red, still a bit sore, but already fading. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I used to be in nursing school, that's all." "You saved his life," the woman replied gently. "I was just doing what I was taught. That's more than most." Melanie took a breath. The weight of everything was beginning to feel like gravity pressing inward. The struggle to pay for medication, the night shifts, the dreams she buried. Now this, rising back up as if the past had decided to knock again. She didn't offer an interview, but she did allow the woman to pass along a message to the family. She said she was glad he was okay, that she hadn't done it for thanks, that she had just happened to be there at the right time. But the story had already taken a life of its own. Over the next few days, neighbors stopped her on the street. Strangers approached her at the market. A local pastor mentioned her in a sermon. Some people tried to donate money. One woman left a thank you card on her doorstep. Melanie turned down the attention where she could and ignored the rest, trying to fold her life back into the quiet corners she understood. But one afternoon, Aiden came home with a drawing from school. It was a picture of her, kneeling beside a man on the ground, drawn in crayon with wide, loving strokes. Above it he had written, "My mom is the bravest." Melanie pressed the paper to her chest and sat very still. The world had seen her. Somehow, despite all her efforts to disappear into survival, they had seen her. The question now was what she would do with that. The knock this time was not from a journalist or a curious neighbor. It came on a quiet Wednesday morning, just after Melanie had finished folding a small basket of laundry, still warm and smelling faintly of lavender. She had just started her second cup of coffee when it came. 3 even knocks, purposeful and calm. She hesitated, glancing at the clock. Aiden was at school. She hadn't scheduled any deliveries. Her first instinct was caution, but something about the rhythm of the knock made her curious rather than nervous. She opened the door slowly and found 2 people standing in the hallway. The woman was dressed in business, casual clothing, her posture neat, her expression careful but kind. She held a small folder in one hand. Beside her stood a man Melanie recognized instantly from the news. His face was thinner now than it had been in the hospital photographs, but it was unmistakable. Dr. Howard Kim looked older up close, more human than the confident headshot she had seen. There was no coat or prestige in his appearance now, just a softness in his eyes and a sense of vulnerability that settled like a quiet truth between them. Melanie blinked in surprise, her hand still on the door. Her instinct told her to apologize, though she couldn't explain why. "We're sorry to drop in unannounced," the woman said, her voice gentle. "I'm Savannah. This is my father, Dr. Kim. We've been trying to find you." Melanie nodded, unsure what else to do. She didn't know whether to invite them in or close the door and pretend this wasn't happening. "I saw the posts," she said. "The photo. I didn't want attention." "We understand," Savannah replied. "We really do, but we had to try. We needed to thank you in person." Melanie stepped aside. She didn't say come in, but she didn't stop them either. They moved past her quietly, the hallway too narrow to avoid brushing against her as they entered the small living room. The space was tidy, but modest. The couch sagged in the middle, and the floor had a few scuffs where Aiden had dragged a toy train back and forth for months. Dr. Kim took a slow seat on the edge of the couch, as if still unsure whether his body would support him the way it used to. Savannah remained standing, her eyes scanning the room, not with judgment but curiosity. Melanie sat down across from them and folded her hands in her lap. "I wasn't expecting this," she said. "My daughter told me everything," Dr. Kim said softly. "About the post, The photo, the girl who called 911. But none of that could really explain what you did. I needed to see you for myself. Melanie glanced down, embarrassed. She wanted to say it wasn't a big deal, but she knew that wouldn't be true. I didn't do anything someone else wouldn't have done, she said. But they didn't, Savannah said. You did. You acted. You saved his life. There was a long pause. Melanie looked between them, unsure what to say. I was in nursing school, she said finally. Years ago. I never finished. Life got in the way. My son, he changed everything. I had to leave. I guess I remembered more than I thought. Savannah's expression shifted, not with pity, but with something closer to admiration. You didn't forget, she said. You held on to it. That's rare. Melanie nodded. She felt exposed in a way she hadn't expected. She had managed to keep her past locked behind responsibility for so long. It felt strange to have it acknowledged again, especially by people who lived in the world she had once dreamed of joining. I've kept up a little, she said. I read articles sometimes, follow medical accounts online, just so I don't lose everything I learned. Dr. Kim leaned forward slightly. Have you ever thought about going back? He asked. Melanie looked at him. That question landed with more weight than she could prepare for. All the time, she admitted. But I can't afford school again. I work cleaning buildings at night. I take care of Aiden. The time, the money, the energy. It's just not realistic anymore. What if it was? Savannah asked. Melanie narrowed her eyes, not from suspicion, but confusion. What do you mean? Savannah opened the folder she had been carrying. Inside was a printed application packet and a letter of recommendation. Melanie didn't touch it, just stared. We spoke to the nursing program director at City Health, Savannah said. They run an accelerated reinstatement track for students who left in good standing. You're eligible. You could test in to finish your last year. Clinicals would be part-time, flexible. There's a grant program that would cover tuition. We've already made a few calls. Melanie shook her head slightly, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Why are you doing this? Because someone like you doesn't belong behind a mop at midnight, Dr. Kim said. You belong beside patients. You belong in a hospital. And because I wouldn't be here if you hadn't been. Melanie swallowed hard. The emotion threatened to spill over, but she fought it back. It wasn't about the gesture. It was about being seen, being believed in. For the first time in years, someone was telling her that her dreams weren't foolish, that her sacrifices didn't make her less worthy. I'm not asking for charity, she said quietly. This isn't charity, Savannah replied. It's gratitude, and maybe a little investment. I think you'd be an extraordinary nurse. Melanie reached for the folder, her hands trembling slightly. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried all the versions of herself she had buried. She looked up at them again. They were watching her carefully, not pressuring, not pushing, just offering. I need time to think, she said. Of course, Savannah said, but whatever you decide, we're here, and we're not going to forget what you did. After they left, Melanie stood in the middle of the room, the folder pressed to her chest. The clock ticked quietly. Outside, traffic passed, like nothing had changed. But inside her, something had shifted. A small door had opened. One she had locked so long ago she thought she had lost the key. Maybe it was still there. Maybe the path she had abandoned wasn't gone, just waiting for her to turn around. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine that she might. The folder sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Melanie would glance at it in passing while pouring cereal or reheating leftovers or wiping down the table after Aiden had gone to bed. It never moved from its spot, like a guest waiting silently to be acknowledged. She told herself she was too busy to read it through, but the truth was she had already read every word twice on the first night. She just didn't know what to do about it. During those 3 days, she went about her life the way she always had. She worked her cleaning shift at the office park, nodding to the security guard who handed her a lukewarm coffee each night. She helped Aiden with his spelling worksheets, boiled water for pasta, folded clothes at the laundromat. She tried to keep everything in balance, because any small shift in her routine always rippled out in ways she couldn't afford. But underneath it all, the decision pulsed like a heartbeat she could feel in her palms. She hadn't spoken to Savannah or Dr. Kim since they left. There had been no pressure, no follow-up, just silence. That kind of respect made the choice feel heavier, not lighter. It meant it was truly hers to make. No one was coming to drag her forward. No one was pushing from behind. She was being offered a hand, but only if she wanted to take it. That evening, after Aiden had fallen asleep with a superhero sticker still stuck to his cheek, Melanie made herself a cup of tea and stood by the window. The apartment complex courtyard below was dark, the lamplight flickering through the rusted gate. Someone walked their dog in silence. A car door slammed in the distance. The world kept moving the way it always did, regardless of whether anyone noticed. She picked up the folder for the third time, pulled out the first page, and stared at the reinstatement checklist. Her name was already printed at the top, typed in, bold, Melanie Carter. Seeing it there, official and unblinking, felt like looking at a stranger, or maybe an old friend she had lost touch with. She traced the edge of the page with her thumb, then sat down and reread the timeline. If she started now, she could finish within a year. Classes 2 days a week, 1 weekend clinical rotation, online modules. Most of her previous credits accepted. The hospital had already agreed to be her site placement, pending final approval. Her chest tightened when she read that last line. Someone had pulled strings for her, but no one had asked for anything in return. She set the paper down and leaned back in the chair. The hum of the fridge filled the silence. Her eyes closed briefly. She imagined herself in a classroom again. Scrubs instead of cleaning clothes. A stethoscope in her pocket. Studying after Aiden went to sleep, reviewing anatomy while folding socks. It didn't feel like fantasy. It felt like a place she had once lived and could maybe live in again. But the fear came too. Not the fear of failure. That part she could stomach. What scared her was the cost. The time away from Aiden, the late nights when she might be too tired to read to him. The stress of exams, the logistics of childcare, the worry that she would be selfish for trying to build something when survival had always been enough. And yet, she thought, what if it wasn't selfish? What if it was the opposite? She could become someone Aiden could look up to in a new way. Not just the mom who kept the lights on and meals warm, but someone who returned to something hard and didn't flinch. She could teach him, without words, that it was okay to want more, that dreams didn't expire, even when life tried to bury them. The next morning, Melanie walked Aiden to school like always. The air was crisp and bright. She listened to him chatter about the art project they were working on and the boy in his class who brought cupcakes without permission. At the school gate, he hugged her twice before running toward the door. She stood there for a moment longer than usual, watching him disappear into the crowd. Instead of heading back home, she turned right and walked to the bus stop. She boarded the number 14 and took a seat by the window, the folder tucked into her bag like something precious. The ride took her through neighborhoods she used to know by heart, past the old coffee shop where she once studied for exams, past the gym where her clinical partner had taught CPR on weekends. The city had changed in places, but not in the ways that mattered. When she reached the hospital, she hesitated at the entrance. She hadn't been through these doors since her last clinical shift, the day before she withdrew from school. She remembered walking out that day feeling like a part of her had been sealed off. Now, as the glass doors slid open, she stepped back into it quietly, unsure of how she would be received. But no one stopped her. No one questioned her. She found the administrative office on the second floor and asked for the admissions coordinator. They directed her to a small office with a plaque that read, A. Pritchard, RN MSN. Melanie knocked, and the woman behind the desk looked up with a smile that didn't fade when Melanie introduced herself. "We've been expecting you," she said. take your time. They went over the paperwork together. Melanie asked questions, practical ones, childcare resources, transportation, clinical schedules. The answers were clear. There were grants for single parents, on-campus tutoring, evening support groups. The program had changed since she last attended. It had grown more flexible, more human. When she left the office, the folder was lighter. It no longer held just a possibility. It held a start date. On the walk back to the bus stop, Melanie didn't cry, though her eyes stung. She felt strange, like she was walking between two versions of herself, the old one and the one not yet formed. She thought about how long it had taken to get to this day, and how it had come not with a bang, but with a collapse, a breathless jogger, and a decision made in 30 seconds. That night, she sat on the floor of the living room while Aiden colored beside her. She watched him draw a blue sky with stars scattered across it, and when he looked up, she asked him a question she had never asked before. "If Mommy went back to school," she said slowly, "would you be okay with that? I'd still be home in the mornings and at bedtime, but I might be tired some nights. I might need help with things." He nodded seriously, considering. "Would you still make pancakes on Saturdays?" he asked. She smiled. "Always." "Then I think it's a good idea." She leaned over and kissed the top of his head. He kept coloring, unbothered, as if she had just told him they were out of milk. But for Melanie, it was everything. Later, she set the folder on the kitchen table and added something to the cover. A sticky note, scribbled in pen, with a date and a word she hadn't used in years. Start. The first day back in a classroom didn't feel triumphant. It felt cautious, like easing into water that might be too cold. Melanie stood outside the nursing department's main lecture hall for a long moment before pushing the door open. The room was already half full. Most of the students were younger, some only just out of high school, with backpacks that still had tags and coffee cups clutched like shields. A few turned to glance at her, but none stared. She chose a seat near the edge of the row, not too far forward, not too far back. Safe, neutral. Her fingers shook slightly as she took out her notebook. Everything around her smelled like floor wax and new books, and that smell pulled something deep out of her memory, something she hadn't realized she'd missed. It wasn't fear. It was familiarity. The professor arrived on time, an older woman with steel-gray hair, and a voice that filled the room without needing to rise. She welcomed them, listed expectations, and dove directly into pathophysiology as if it were the most natural thing to discuss at 9 a.m. Melanie listened, scribbled notes, and tried to stop checking the clock. After class, she found a quiet bench near the campus courtyard to eat the peanut butter sandwich she had packed. Her phone buzzed with a message from the school's student-parent liaison reminding her of upcoming resources for single mothers returning to education. She hadn't signed up yet. She still wasn't sure if she needed to, but she kept the number saved in her phone. That afternoon, she walked to the hospital for her orientation. It felt different to walk those halls as a student again, not a visitor. The white tiles and clipped voices of nurses at shift change stirred something in her chest, like a rhythm she had forgotten but could still recognize. The woman leading the tour was brisk but warm, guiding the small group of clinical students through departments they would rotate through in the coming months. Melanie stayed toward the back, absorbing everything, nodding quietly. They passed through a pediatric unit and into a rehab wing. At one point, as they turned a corner, a familiar face stepped out of a patient room. It took Melanie a full second to place her. Savannah. She was in scrubs now, holding a clipboard, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked up from her notes and met Melanie's eyes with something like quiet surprise that softened into joy. "Melanie," she said, almost under her breath. The other students moved on without noticing. Savannah stepped closer, still holding her chart against her chest. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes," she said. Melanie gave a small smile, not quite sure what her face was doing. "I wasn't sure either," she said. Savannah glanced at the group, rounding the next corner. "Walk with me for a second," she said. They stepped to the side of the hallway near the window, letting the natural light pour in. Outside, clouds drifted slowly past the top of the nearby parking structure. "I didn't want to push," Savannah said. I'm glad." "I'm still scared," Melanie admitted. "Good," Savannah said with a wry grin. "It means you know what's at stake." They stood in silence for a beat longer. Then Melanie adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "It feels strange," she said. "Coming back after everything, like I'm pretending to be someone I used to be." "No," Savannah said. "You're becoming someone you were always meant to be." That night, Melanie tucked Aiden into bed after reading the 3rd chapter of his new dinosaur book. He had asked 1,000 questions, most of which she answered, some of which she promised to Google in the morning. As she turned off the light, he asked her if her school was like his. She sat on the edge of the bed and considered the question. "It's different," she said, "but also the same. We both learn things we didn't know, and sometimes we get nervous, but that's part of learning." "Did you make any friends?" he asked. She smiled in the dark. "Maybe," she said. "I think it takes time." He nodded, as if he understood more than he should, then curled under the blanket and drifted off. Later, she sat with her textbook open at the kitchen table, eyes scanning the pages on cardiac rhythms, the irony of the subject not lost on her. The terms came back like old neighbors, some familiar, others needing reintroduction. She highlighted and underlined, her handwriting neater now than it had been years ago. The muscle memory of studying returned slowly, like a language she thought she had forgotten. In the days that followed, the routine started to form. Mornings were chaos, toasts burned, socks vanished, backpacks were misplaced, but they always made it. She would kiss Aiden's cheek and catch the bus with her heart still racing from the scramble. Classes settled into rhythm. Clinical prep was hard, exhausting, but something inside her woke up during patient care that hadn't stirred in years. She felt useful. She felt seen. Some instructors started to notice. They praised her calmness, her quick recall of procedures, her ability to remain composed in high-pressure simulations. A few students even started asking her for help before quizzes. It surprised her, but she found she liked it. She liked feeling capable again. She liked remembering what she was good at. She saw Dr. Kim only once, passing through the cardiology wing on her way to a skills lab. He didn't see her, but she paused as he spoke to another physician. He looked healthy, lighter on his feet, his voice full of its old energy. She smiled to herself and kept walking. By the end of her 3rd week, she had passed her first clinical skills evaluation. The instructor handed her a slip of paper with a check mark and a short comment at the bottom. Precise technique, confident presence. She stared at the words longer than she meant to. They were small things, but for her, they meant everything. On Saturday, she and Aiden made pancakes as promised. He insisted on stirring the batter himself, despite the trail of flour left behind on the counter and most of the floor. They ate by the window, watching the morning fog fade slowly from the glass. "Are you going to be a nurse soon?" he asked between bites. "Not yet," she said, "but I'm on my way." He nodded solemnly, as if that answer satisfied something in him. Then he leaned forward. "Can I tell people my mom saves lives?" She set her fork down and looked at him. "You already do," she said. "Every day." After breakfast, while Aiden built a fort from couch cushions, Melanie sat at the table again with her textbooks spread wide. The highlighters were uncapped. The pen in her hand was steady. Outside, the city kept moving. People rushed past each other on errands. Buses pulled into stops. Elevators rose and fell. She had once believed that life would continue without her, unnoticed. But now she knew better. She had stepped into that rushing current once more, and this time she was swimming forward with purpose. Not because she was trying to escape the past, but because the future was finally hers to shape again. It was raining when Melanie received the invitation. The letter had arrived folded neatly in her school mailbox, hand addressed in black ink, with the hospital's embossed seal faintly visible in the corner. She had just come in from her morning class, shoes damp and curls frizzing in the mist, when she slid her fingers under the envelope's flap and pulled out the cream-colored card inside. Her eyes scanned the message quickly, once without breathing, then again with her mouth slightly open. The hospital's annual honors gala was being held the following Saturday evening, an event usually reserved for faculty, senior staff, and key partners. The letter was signed by Dr. Howard Kim, extending a formal invitation in recognition of an outstanding act of compassion and service. It was personal, clear, and impossible to misinterpret. She wasn't being invited as a student. She was being honored as the person who had saved his life. Her first reaction was a firm, quiet no. The gala was not a space where she felt she belonged. It meant cocktail dresses and soft lighting and voices that never had to be raised to be heard. It meant names whispered across tables with weight. It meant a world she had once stood at the edge of, peering in like a child outside a glass window. Her place was at her desk, in her study group, at home with Aiden. That night, she placed the invitation in the kitchen drawer and tried not to think about it. But Aiden noticed. He always did. He found the card 2 days later while looking for a rubber band to shoot across the room. "Is this for a party?" he asked, holding it up with both hands. Melanie smiled, took it gently, and folded it shut again. "It's for a hospital event. I don't think I'm going." "Why not?" he asked. She paused. The answer formed easily. "Too expensive, too fancy, not for me." But the words didn't make it past her lips. Instead, she studied his face, the same one that had watched her give CPR in the park, the same one that had drawn her as a hero in crayon. "I don't have anything to wear," she said at last, avoiding the other truths. Aiden looked serious for a moment, then nodded. "I think you should go. Maybe they'll give you another medal." "I didn't get a medal. They should give you two." Later that afternoon, she stood in front of her closet, the door creaking slightly open. Most of her clothes were built for movement. Scrubs, jeans, plain shirts that survived the laundromat cycle without complaint. But at the back, tucked in a dry cleaning bag she had never opened, was a dress she had bought during nursing school for a scholarship dinner she never ended up attending. She had saved up for it, brought it home with a receipt she couldn't really afford, and hung it up like a promise. Then life fell apart, and it stayed hidden. She unzipped the bag slowly. The dress was still smooth, still deep navy, with a soft shimmer under the overhead light. When she slipped it on, it still fit. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror. She didn't look like the version of herself she saw every day, but she didn't look like a stranger either, just someone she hadn't had time to be. She decided to go. On the evening of the event, Aiden sat on the edge of the couch in his pajamas, watching her apply the smallest bit of mascara. She had borrowed a pair of heels from a neighbor, black and barely worn. Her curls were pinned loosely, and she wore a silver necklace her mother had given her before she passed. Aiden's eyes lit up when she turned around. "You look like a princess," he said. She laughed. "Not quite," she said. "More like a nurse pretending not to be tired." She kissed his forehead, whispered a thank you to the neighbor babysitting for the night, and stepped into the evening air. The gala was held in the hospital's private event wing, a space she had only seen from the outside. The entrance glowed with soft light, and scattered raindrops on the steps shimmered under the golden canopy. She walked slowly, careful not to slip. Inside, she checked her name at the door and was escorted to a table near the front. Her name card was printed in elegant script, and beside it, one for Savannah. The room was full of soft laughter, clinking glasses, and murmured greetings. Waiters moved like clockwork between tables. A small quartet played near the stage. Melanie sat down and tried to breathe. Savannah arrived a few minutes later, smiling warmly as she approached. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, settling into the seat beside her. "You look beautiful." Melanie flushed slightly, unsure of how to take the compliment. Thank you. I almost didn't. I'm glad you changed your mind. They talked easily through dinner. Savannah asked about her classes, about Aiden, about the upcoming clinical rotation Melanie had been dreading. Their conversation drifted naturally, and Melanie found herself laughing more than she had expected. When dessert was cleared, the lights dimmed slightly, and a man stepped up to the podium. He wore a tuxedo and spoke with the calm of someone used to holding attention. "This year," he said, "we were reminded that medicine does not only live within the walls of this hospital. Sometimes it finds us in unexpected places, brought forth by unexpected people." Melanie's stomach tightened. He continued, sharing a brief account of Dr. Kim's collapse and the woman who had saved him. He didn't say her name at first. He let the room sit in the story, let the silence honor the moment. Then he gestured toward her table. "Please join me in recognizing Melanie Carter," he said, "whose actions remind us what compassion looks like in its purest form." The applause began slowly, then swelled. Melanie stood, not knowing what to do with her hands. A few people in the crowd had tears in their eyes. Some stood. She crossed to the stage carefully, heels clicking softly, heart pounding in her ears. The man handed her a small plaque. She didn't really hear the rest of what he said. She could only see the faces turned toward her, the ones that smiled without expectation, the ones that saw her. As she walked back to her seat, Savannah reached out and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You belong here," she whispered. Melanie sat down and let that truth sink in. Later, after the event had ended, she stood outside under the awning waiting for her ride. The rain had stopped. The streetlight reflected in the shallow puddles, casting small ripples of light. She took the plaque out of her bag and looked at the engraved words. There was no mention of her struggles, no list of obstacles, just her name and a single phrase. "For compassion and action." She smiled, tucked it back into her bag, and looked up at the sky. It wasn't about medals. It wasn't about applause. It wasn't even about being seen. It was about remembering that she had saved someone and, in doing so, had begun saving herself. Spring arrived gently. The air smelled different, like warmed earth and something newly growing. The sidewalks that had once felt cold under Melanie's sneakers now pulsed with light. Tiny blossoms appeared on the trees lining the schoolyard, and Aiden had taken to kicking off his shoes the moment they got home. Running barefoot across the tiny strip of grass near their apartment building, like it was a field meant just for him. Everything felt lighter, not because the weight had gone away, but because Melanie had learned to carry it with a strength she hadn't realized she had. The days were long but full. Morning classes were still a flurry of note-taking and whispered study groups. Clinical rotations left her feet sore and her back aching, but she didn't mind the exhaustion anymore. It meant she was doing something. It meant she was learning with her hands, with her heart. She found herself speaking up more during rounds, asking questions without apology. Instructors began trusting her with more complicated tasks, and other students looked to her during group simulations. She wasn't just catching up, she was leading. Evenings were her quiet reward. She and Aiden would eat dinner at the table she had scrubbed to near Shine after each shift, laughing over his stories about playground politics and spelling tests. After he fell asleep, Melanie would study until midnight, her books spread across the couch, sticky notes dotting the coffee table like breadcrumbs in a forest of information. Her apartment was still small. Her paycheck still thin, but there was movement now, a forward rhythm that kept her from feeling stuck. One Thursday afternoon, her instructor pulled her aside after clinicals. The hallway buzzed with the sounds of carts being wheeled and nurses swapping reports, but the woman's voice cut through clearly. "There's a position opening up in the cardiac step-down unit," she said. "They're looking for students to onboard as externs before graduation. It's part-time, paid. You're ready." Melanie blinked, not sure she'd heard right. She had imagined finishing school. She had imagined passing exams. She had not allowed herself to imagine being asked, being wanted. I don't even know if I'll qualify, she said quietly. You do, the instructor said. They asked for you by name. The next week, Melanie interviewed in a borrowed blazer and shaking hands. By the end of the following day, she received a call offering her the job. Her first thought was Aiden. Her second was her mother, who had always believed she'd wear scrubs one day. Her third was the woman she had been the morning she walked into the pharmacy and was told there was nothing they could do. She accepted. The externship brought new challenges. The patients were more complex, the pace faster, but the staff treated her like one of their own. Dr. Create, Kim passed her in the hallway during her first shift and paused just long enough to say, "Good to have you here." That was all. No ceremony, no second glances, just respect. The nurses she worked with taught her things she had only seen in textbooks. How to spot a subtle change in rhythm before it became something worse. How to comfort a family without needing to say too much. How to move through chaos without letting the chaos move through you. There were hard nights, days when the weight of everything caught up to her, times when a patient coded and she froze for half a second too long, but there was always someone beside her. And each time, she found her footing a little faster. At home, Aiden adjusted with quiet pride. He stopped asking her if she was tired and started leaving her notes, little scraps of paper that said, "You're awesome," or "Keep going," or sometimes just a smiley face. One night, she found one taped to the fridge that read, "You save people now." She left it there for weeks until the ink began to fade. As summer edged closer, she neared graduation. Her final exams loomed. Her classmates buzzed about job offers and apartment moves. Melanie moved through it all with a calm steadiness, not because she wasn't scared, but because she had already passed the hardest tests of all, the test of getting up every day when she wanted to give up, the test of continuing despite no safety net, the test of believing in herself even when the world gave her every reason not to. Savannah met her for coffee one Sunday morning, sitting across from her in a cafe filled with chatter and the smell of ground beans and fresh bread. She wore a sweater too warm for the weather, and her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger. "You've come so far," she said after a few minutes of catching up. "I'm not done yet," Melanie said with a soft smile. "I know. But it's okay to pause and look at how far you've come." Melanie looked down at her hands, then back out the window where the sun was breaking through cloud cover. "I think the hardest part was not the studying, not the work. It was believing I was allowed to want this again." Savannah reached over and placed a hand on hers. "Well, you were. And now you've earned it." The graduation ceremony was held on a warm afternoon in a hall that smelled faintly of flowers and floor polish. Aiden sat in the front row, his legs too short to touch the floor, holding a tiny bouquet of carnations in his lap. When her name was called, he jumped to his feet and clapped louder than anyone else. Melanie walked across the stage in her pressed white uniform, cap pinned carefully, heart pounding but steady. Her diploma felt light in her hands, not because it wasn't hard-won, but because it carried more joy than weight. That night, they didn't go out to celebrate. Instead, she and Aiden cooked dinner together, spaghetti and garlic toast, and danced in the living room to songs from the radio. She hung her graduation photo on the wall with a dollar store frame. Beside it, she placed a picture Aiden had drawn. It showed a nurse with curly hair and a smile, standing next to a boy with a cape. Above it, in his best handwriting, he had written, "My mom saves the world." Melanie stood looking at that drawing for a long time. It wasn't about medals. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about coming back to herself. It was about reaching down into a life that had tried to shrink her and finding room to grow again. When she went to bed that night, Aiden was already asleep. The city hummed outside, distant and alive. Her phone buzzed once with a message from a nurse at the hospital confirming her first full shift as a graduate nurse the following week. Melanie turned off the light, pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't dream of what might have been.